All right, it is 5 past the hour. Welcome to our third session of our seminar series in history at Newcastle. I'd like to just very briefly thank Kathy and Sasha for filling in for me over the last two sessions, and I'm glad to be back in the room and hear some of these wonderful talks. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Pamalon clan of the Awabakal people and pay respects to our elders past, present, and emerging. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome my colleague and office mate, Dr. Kit Candlin. Kit needs very little introduction for those of us here, but for those who may be watching later on YouTube, I'll go ahead and say a few words that he is a senior lecturer in the history of the Americas here at the University of Newcastle, and is a past president of the Australian Association for Caribbean Studies and a member of the Center for the Study of Violence. He has numerous publications in that field and is, we're very fortunate to have him as an expert here at our university. Today, Kit will be talking to us about several gross blunders, the suicide of British officers in the Windward Islands during Grenada's Fédon rebellion from 1795 to 1796. So I will get the screen shared and I will pass it off to Kit without any further ado.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Hello, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about what is now a somewhat backwater, colourful little island in the southern Caribbean, but in the 1790s it was almost pretty close to the centre of the world, if we take China out of that equation, but certainly where a lot of the action in the Atlantic world and the Americas was centred in the middle of the 1790s. So that's what it looks like today, and indeed it hasn't really changed much. You can see the verdant hills, the mountains that dominate the centre of the island. It's not a very big island, although it appears in this picture you see here to be somewhat large. It's actually not a big island. I've got some maps coming up shortly. So this paper investigates the suicide of two British officers during the Fédon rebellion that broke out in the British Caribbean colony of Grenada in 1795. One of the officers was Colin Lindsay, a senior army officer who came to take command of British forces in the region at the start of the rebellion against British rule in 1795. And the other was George Vaughan, a promising young naval captain and Lindsay's naval counterpart in the same conflict, who killed himself off Trinidad the following year, just as the rebels were being defeated on Grenada. And though these men died during a local struggle, both were part of a much wider war between Britain and Republican France and their allies that was fought out across colonial possessions in the West Indies during the 1790s, and of course involved an awful lot of enslaved people and free people and those known at the time as free coloureds, or those of mixed race, as they were known at the time, as I said. By March 1795, when the Grenada Rebellion broke out, that wider conflict had grown desperate. The deaths of these officers came, therefore, at a time of high tension and frayed nerves in the Caribbean. Both men were under considerable pressure to carry out their respective commands and resolve the situation in Grenada quickly. Now, on this map you see here, Grenada is in the lower right-hand corner. It's just above Tobago there, just above Trinidad. Its location is absolutely crucial when it comes to both strategy and indeed trade routes, because the trade routes come in through Trinidad and St. Vincent via Grenada and Tobago and then sweep upwards into what is the Greater Antilles, places like Haiti and Cuba. Haiti is the focus in the 1790s because in 1793, Saint-Domingue, as it was then known, was the richest colony in the world, and it was French. And 2/5 of the world's sugar and 3/5 of the world's coffee came from what is now the country of Haiti. It was incredibly valuable, and they'd fallen apart into a desperate civil war that was 4 or 5 ways at different times. and the French planters were trying to hang on. Much of this was caused by the French Revolution, because, of course, in 1789, when France falls into revolution, what happens to its empire? And the empire falls into civil war. And so this is spreading all around the Caribbean, all these little colonies here, as you can see from my map on the right. They're all controlled by different empires. So you can see all those, the island chain there, and you can see, for example, Tobago is occupied by the British in 1795. Grenada is UK, St. Vincent is UK, Barbados is UK. But the other two big islands that matter in the 1790s beyond Haiti are the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, again, up that chain. And you can see how interspaced they are. So politically, it's an extremely difficult situation. Of course, these islands are slave colonies filled with enslaved people who don't like being enslaved. So there's extra tension in the air. And that, of course, is the island of Grenada. Hasn't changed much at all. That view that you saw at the beginning of the talk is from what you see on the left-hand side there. That's a view from Goyave and St. John on that side of the island, but it's very small, about as big as Greater Newcastle, not really much bigger. This research uses the commonalities and divergences in the stories of these men's suicide to help illuminate the phenomenon of suicide as it was amongst military men at the end of the 18th century. I use later 19th century findings as well as more modern research into suicidology to investigate more fully ideas that in the 1790s were unknown. While there has been considerable amount of research conducted into self-destruction in the early modern period, evidence for the phenomenon in the military is notoriously difficult to find. Part of the problem is that the British military only began to keep statistics on the causes of death in the late 1820s, and then only loosely and with much inaccuracy. It was not until after the Crimean War in the early 1850s that real statistics were gathered. We knew, for example, who was wounded and who died in a battle or a conflict, for example, but beyond that, we don't have any statistics at all when it comes to soldiers' health, and certainly not mental health. It was not until, as I said, after the Crimean War in the early 1850s that real statistics were gathered, and the military began to deal with soldier suicide as a medical problem to be theorized on and measured. Considering this, these two deaths represent, therefore, extremely rare examples of military suicide from the 1790s that were too obvious to obfuscate or ignore. When seen individually, these tragedies can tell us much, but the real value in this history is the fact that these two deaths were profoundly connected and occurred in the same conflict almost at the same time, about a year apart. By having two together like this paper is able, therefore, to ask further questions that would not be the case if it's one individual. I argue that the demise of these two officers seemed to emerge from a combination of factors rather than from one event that triggered their actions. Even though both men would blame themselves for specific mistakes and errors, there were other elements at play, not least of which was the context in which they operated, the unfolding sequence of events, and various pressures they faced. Beyond that context, this argument uses their collective stories to explore changing notions of class, professionalism, and leadership that were important elements in their worldview and their demise. I argue further that the cultural shifts that occurred across the late 18th century regarding suicide, mental health, and science may have likewise influenced both men. And finally, this paper sheds further light on the development of concepts such as honor, sensibility, nostalgia, loneliness, and melancholy that I argue were also inherent or at least present in these stories. As such, this research forms part of what Dorothea Stukenboom and others have described as the new military history, which seeks to explore the military beyond traditional battlefield analysis into newer areas of research. And in writing about this topic, I'm also acutely aware of the difficult, sensitive nature of suicide, and it's rare to meet someone who's not been touched by the tragedy of this phenomenon in some way in their life. And of course, mental health, both in the 18th century and today, remains a major topic of medical and public concern, as well as often damaging speculation. One of the themes this article engages with, for example, is the concept of suicide clusters and the dangerous power of suggestion that could well have been a motivating factor for Vaughan in particular, who died later. Context. The Fédon rebellion that took the lives of Lindsay, Vaughan and many thousands of others broke out at a critical time for the British in the West Indies. Julian Fédon, a mixed-race planter from the French community on the island, and his compatriots had a well-advanced plot to take advantage of the Revolutionary War and overthrow the British government. Once that had been achieved, and with the support from Republicans elsewhere, they would set up a French-styled republic with Fédon as the leader. At the same time, unrest threatened in other British colonies nearby, such as St. Vincent and Dominica, as emissaries from the Jacobin leadership in Guadeloupe, spurred on by disaffected French residents, enslaved and indigenous groups across the southern Caribbean, joined in the process with promises of support from the French Republic. In early March, this cajoling resulted in rebellion breaking out, finally in St. Vincent, and then just days later, Fédon launched his rebellion in Grenada. The British and other loyal residences in Grenada were severely under strength, and they struggled to defend the capital, St. George's, which you see here. It really hasn't changed much in 200 years. Rebel numbers grew alarmingly from a core base of disaffected free coloureds, numbering in the low hundreds, to a massive enslaved revolt, which counted at least 7,000 adherents colony-wide. Meanwhile, the overstretched British command in Barbados and Martinique, they'd occupied Martinique as a result of the French Revolution, headed by the recently appointed Sir John Vaughan, quickly settled on Colonel Colin Lindsay, then acting command of the 46th Regiment of Foot, to command a relief force to rescue the besieged in Grenada. It would prove to be a fatal decision. To the shock of the army, within a month, Lindsay would be dead by his own hand, and once again, the British would be on the back foot. A combination of bad luck, calumny, and overstretch, not to mention the surprising tenacity of the rebels and their self-emancipated ex-enslaved army, would mean that following Lindsay's death, it would be a full year and a half before the British in Grenada were finally able to defeat the rebels. I'll deal with each suicide and the brief details for each, and then move on to the analysis shortly. It's often been called the strange death of Colin Lindsay. In fact, there is a history of the island of Grenada where a chapter that deals with this particular attack was described as the strange death of Colin Lindsay, but it was dealt with briefly in this history. And I think that, though, encapsulates the whole mystery, if you like, of why this man suddenly shot himself. So the immediate circumstances that led to Lindsay's death can tell us much about the pressures he was under and the sequence of events that led to his decisions. These details are therefore worth dwelling on. Lindsay was quickly promoted to Brigadier General by Vaughan, his friend, as it turns out, in haste, and sent to Grenada with just 20 artillerymen and some light cannon. 2 days later, they were joined by 150 men of the 68th Regiment coming in from St. Lucia. They were bringing in troops from all over in small numbers because they were very overstretched. As Lindsay's correspondence makes clear, his plan was to organise an immediate attack on Fédon's Belvedere plantation with all the forces available to him. This had been the base for the rebels, if you like, high up in the mountains. You can see some of the views there from Fédon's encampment or his plantation in the top two photographs. Dense forest. It's quite cool up there in the mountains, and it's very difficult to get to on muddy tracks and roads. It was no easy task, as I said, as the plantation lay high up in the central mountains, amongst densely forested hillsides choked with undergrowth, served by a couple of well-worn mule tracks. These tracks were often left muddy from the frequent rains that fell at altitude in the colony. Moreover, on his arrival at St. George's, Lindsay was greeted by a township in considerable disarray and confusion, with many residents in blind panic. In the opening hours of the rebellion, the colony's governor, Ninian Hume, had been captured in a moment of high drama, and the civilian president of the governor's council, along with a junior officer, had assumed command. They were clearly having trouble containing the desperate fears of the population. Everyone could see the fires of burning plantations beyond the confines of the town in which they were besieged. Most believed they would be overrun within days, perhaps hours. Their arrival of Lindsay brought immense, if temporary, relief to residents, but their insecurity in the state of the town could easily have impressed upon the general the gravity and the precariousness of the situation, which might well have added considerably to the pressure he was under. After inspecting the defences and the emplacements, Lindsay immediately assembled all the militia and regular units in and around the town. Doing so brought on the first culture shock that Lindsay had to deal with, and one he clearly found perturbing. An eyewitness remarked on Lindsay's naivety as to the ways of the Caribbean and his consternation as he looked out on the trifling force available to him. Where are the gentlemen planters? There's not a moment to be lost. Why don't they collect their Negro men? He argued. Lindsay, to his evident disgust, had to be told that most of the British planters, the actual owners of estates, were absentees away in Britain. All Lindsay could do was order more loyal Africans to be found to augment what forces he had. Lindsay was clearly hoping for leadership and a stiffer level of resolve. What he got, however, was a British West Indian colony far removed from North America or the Europe that he was used to. Eventually, to add to the 250 regulars available for offensive action, Lindsay managed to assemble 300 men of the militia, who were top-heavy with untested, self-appointed amateurs as officers from a variety of units, and around 150 enslaved men armed with machetes, pikes, 750 men in all. The way up to Belvedere was not easy in the mud and terrain, and they were attacked on several occasions. What should have been a rapid ascent to the real fortifications took far longer than expected. Fédon had embedded himself behind many gun emplacements and walls of wood and stone. What should have been a rapid ascent, as I said, took longer than expected. At one point, Lindsay grabbed the musket from a wounded man and took part in the hand-to-hand fighting himself as they charged up the hills. George Hume, the captured governor's brother, on reflection, thought Lindsay was a madman. Another eyewitness wrote that dislodging the considerable party of banditti took most of the evening. Despite the delays, by nightfall, Lindsay and his little army was very close to the main camp. Lindsay bivouacked his force where they stood around the summits of two hills known as Felix and St. John that lay before the plantation Belvedere at a slightly lower elevation. Lindsay chose a row of slave huts for his officers and himself and tents for everyone else. The storming of Belvedere was put off till the following morning. To fight fresh the next day was the plan, but by midnight the weather had changed markedly. The skies opened and the rains came down in torrents, thoroughly drenching the ground and the men, and it would rain like this for a week. For the next 5 days, the little force was exposed on those two hills overlooked by the higher vantage points around Belvedere, as the general waited for better weather. But slowly Lindsay's army began to fall apart. There was a lot of drinking amongst the troops that was uncontrollable. Some of the correspondence between Lindsay and President Mackenzie in St. George's over these crucial few days survives in the recollections of several eyewitnesses who wrote accounts. On the 16th, Lindsay wrote to Mackenzie complaining that everyone, as he put it, of the mules had escaped and that the Negroes skulk out of the way. His desperation was becoming increasingly palpable. At the start, this had been seen at most as a 2-day operation, not a week-long expedition in the rain with failing troops of decidedly variable quality and terrible supply lines. At first, Lindsay had been sanguine about events and spoke positively of the men. Quite quickly, though, his mood had soured. The longer they camped in an exposed position in the torrential rain, the worse the situation would get. After spending the 18th and 19th camped on Felix and St. John, Lindsay allowed some militia members to return to St. George's to recuperate, if only for 2 days. It was a demonstration of the frustrations and problems the regular military had in commanding and controlling civilian militias in slave colonies. When they didn't return, he fired off an angry letter to Mackenzie and the council, angrily demanding that they come back. Lindsay again requested more mules for transport and a supply of blankets and shirts. The general wearily recounted that his men had unfortunately lost their haversacks when they had lain them down to engage with the enemy, and the Negroes had stolen them. On the 19th, still on the hill and in the rain, Lindsay wrote a long, distressing letter to Vaughan, his last, as it would turn out, and one that was very far different in tone to that which characterized his authoritative earlier communications with the president. The letter to Vaughan on Martinique outlined in detail what the general thought had been his mistakes and blunders, and his fears for the future of the war. It is not clear what happened on the 20th or the 21st. One might assume that under increasing pressure and concern, especially for the state of his disintegrating army, the unexpected resistance of the enemy, coupled with the realization that his strategy was flawed, the general had been in two minds: wait for further troops and the deleterious militia to show up and resume the attack, or return to St. George's to regroup. Either way, in the end, and as his tortured letter to Vaughan indicated, Lindsay was overtaken by his own mind. At around 5 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of March, 1795, in the pouring rain, standing on the stoop of the miserable slave hut that had been his home for 4 days, General Lindsay blew his brains out with a pistol. The other story is Captain George Vaughan. The demise of Captain Vaughan a year later was no less tragic and no less dramatic. Vaughan had been part of a key dynamic in this conflict, the Royal Navy. They were far more mobile than the army, and what few ships there were patrolled the coasts of the colony, preventing, for the most part, though not entirely, succor arriving from Guadeloupe and reinforcements for Fédon. Further afield, the Navy were employed either supporting the army, running blockades of ports, or chasing down the large numbers of Republican privateers that were infesting the region, emanating mainly out of Guadeloupe. These privateers were not only a huge part of Republican influence and communication networks across the region, but were also deadly at intercepting Allied shipping and their cargoes. In April 1796, HMS Alarm slipped into the still waters of the Gulf of Paria and hove to off Trinidad. She arrived at dusk, escorted by a squadron of sloops. There, they intercepted 10 or so small, nimble Republican coastal cutters that had been preying on the shipping coming out of Port of Spain, Trinidad's capital, for weeks. Trinidad was at that point controlled by the Spanish. Vaughan was in his mid-30s and 2 years into a roving patrol to lend assistance where it was needed. For the past year, that had been Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Grenada. Now things had changed, and reports of French privateers had driven him south. The following year, Trinidad would fall easily to a full-scale British invasion, but for now, Vaughan sought the permission of the neutral Spanish governor before further engaging the French ships. Second in command was Captain Skinner of the sloop Zebra. Vaughan sent Skinner ashore to make introductions. With no wharf, Skinner pulled up on the beach opposite the town as night was closing in. Skinner and a small party landed and went to Government House, then a smart townhouse on the Cal de Marine in the middle of the port. Once inside, Skinner met quickly with the governor's secretary, Diego Mini. Diego Mini was wary of the British, as indeed he was of most people, and as things unfolded, it was perhaps easy to understand why. Skinner also met that night with Mini's boss, the governor, Don Jose Chacon, who would be the last governor, as it turns out, of Spanish Trinidad. A knight of Calatrava and captain general over the island and its dependencies, Chacon had been in the colony since the early 1780s. He got no help from the locals, for they were mostly French Republican refugees, free blacks, and those of mixed race from other colonies, along with fortune seekers of various stripes. Most of these people, as Vaughan was to discover, were not disposed to royalist Spanish rule, nor that of the British. The resident free Spanish population was tiny. Spurred on by the French Revolution, Chacon's authority was daily contested, with protests and threats of violence that in overstretched Spain did nothing to alleviate or help their distant governor. Chacon, worldly and educated, much like his secretary, gave permission to Skinner for Captain Vaughan to engage the privateers around the island. They were a problem for the Spanish, as they were for the British, but the Spanish had no ships and the British did. The Spaniard was perhaps, as I said, grateful for the help, but he warned Skinner to take care because, as he ominously put it, there are too many armed Republicans here already. We are, he would later write, totally dependent on the goodwill of a public composed of people of other nations with but few of our own. After sinking several privateers, that evening Captain Vaughan himself went ashore to meet with Chacon and several British residents who lived in the polyglot town of Port of Spain, the capital. Many of the British residents were glad to see him. Such was the pitiable number in the settlement filled with revolutionaries, some of whom came from the British community. The following night, several British sailors from Vaughan's squadron were drinking on the waterfront. The French privateers who had swum to shore the previous evening were none too happy to see them. Words were spoken, weapons were drawn, and a fight ensued. Hearing the commotion, the sailors were soon joined by their officers. The privateers were no match for the British, but their call to arms and Vive la Republique awakened others to the affray, and soon the British were outnumbered. Saved by the Spanish Guard, they managed to escape back to their ships. The next day, however, Vaughan's patience was all but exhausted. Gathering almost his entire remaining crew and his marines, he loaded up the longboats and arrived on the beach with flags flying, drummers beating a tattoo, and perhaps 300 heavily armed men. Judging by the commotion the previous evening, somewhere in the vicinity of 3,000 to 4,000 inhabitants, white, black, and mixed race, filled the small town. Someone broke into the magazine, stole all the Spanish guns. Many of them were wearing French Republican cockades and other ephemera of the revolution. Many more had come armed. Again, Meany pleaded with Captain Vaughan against taking further action on the shores of the neutral power. Some British residents also sought to calm the situation. After all, they'd still be on the island when the British left and have to face the consequences. Captain Vaughan was endangering all their lives, such was the chaotic society of Trinidad. The British party, particularly the officers, grew wary of the rapidly deteriorating situation. They spoke forcefully to Vaughan, pointing out that even with their numbers, they were no match for such a hostile multitude, and now surrounded on three sides, they were baying for blood. They needed to withdraw. Soon Chacon himself arrived and reasoned with Vaughan that this escalation seriously threatened the sovereignty of Spain and all their lives. Vaughan finally, and much to the relief of many, saw reason. At the very limits of the empire, he was outgunned and out of his depth. The chastened captain promptly turned his men around and went back to his ship with the jeers and hoots of the crowd ringing in their ears. 2 days later, Vaughan on board the Alarm and Skinner on the Zebra returned humiliated to where they had come from, St. George's Harbour in Grenada. A day later, afraid his impetuous act might possibly have caused or created an international incident, perhaps smarting from the loss of face and honour, Captain Vaughan went missing. One of his lieutenants, filling out the ship's log, reported coolly that after a quick search of the cabin and his effects, it appeared that the captain, weighed down with shot, had taken his own life by throwing himself overboard and drowning. It also appears that the crew may have found the body, because under the lieutenant's hand was another later addition, Captain Deceased. What do we make of the sad demise of these two otherwise intelligent and experienced officers? What can their deaths tell us about the changing nature of the society from which they came and the complex societies and situations they found themselves in the months leading up to their final moments? What can their stories tell us about mental health, self-destruction, and the military at the very end of the 18th century? And can anything be gained from studying their deaths collectively? Despite 18th century military innovations in general health, the British Army only began to seriously detail and document causes of death in the late 1820s. Much of this development was a result of medical, social, and philosophical advances made in the 18th century, but also as a direct result of the poor performance of the military in the Caribbean during the Napoleonic Wars. While the mortality among European soldiers and sailors from disease stand out as one of the most alarming sets of statistics from this conflict, a huge range of issues emerged around morale, discipline, and organization. And much of this was highlighted in the 1820s, but it would not be actually measured or acted on until after, as I said at the start, the Crimean War in the 1850s. The military experience in the Napoleonic Wars, as well as colonial service more generally in the early 19th century, acted therefore as the catalyst for these emergent reforms that would occur later. However, mental health and suicide as a specific focus only came about, as I said at the start, as part of the outrage over the shocking state of the British Army and its performance in the Crimean War of 1854-6 and the subsequent inquiries that followed that. The key figure that was arrived at was that while some units suffered more than others, overall suicide rates remained 3 times that of the civilian population, or some 0.34 suicides in every 1,000 serving soldiers per annum in the mid-19th century. As a statistician investigating in the 1860s, George Miller pointed out, evidence as to the actual cause of death in the military before the Crimean conflict very sparse. He argued that given the prejudices towards and the absolute illegality of suicide, felo de se, or self-murder, with its attendant sanctions, many officers, military doctors, and later coroners recorded either insanity, non compos mentis, as a cause of death, or otherwise obfuscated the reality in some ways or lied on the reports. They were worried about wives and children, and even though in Britain by the early 19th century punishments weren't really given out, particularly for military men, nevertheless it was still on the books, and certainly for Europe it was still a big issue. In parts of Europe you could be severely, your offspring and your wife could be severely financially put into straits by the courts if you killed yourself. The army and the navy appeared to suffer similar rates of suicide to which they found in the Crimea, though, earlier on. The rates were estimated with some effort as being most severe amongst those serving overseas, in particular more dangerous or remote regions. Well before the philosopher and sociologist Emil Durkheim theorized on the causes of suicide and an individual's susceptibility to it in the 1890s, Miller in the 1860s also speculated on the role of class and social position, background and occupation in suicide rates amongst those in the military. And he backdated that, as I said, into the 1820s, and I'm backdating it a little bit further into the 1790s. In the 18th century, in which Vaughan and Lindsay grew up, Enlightenment contests between science, reason, and religion were protractedly fought out over contentious issues such as suicide. From the early 18th century, the acceptance of suicide not only as a reality, but one that was worsening, drove both medical and social change. Theorists and stakeholders began to observe the phenomenon less as a sin and more of a medical problem to be solved. As many observers in the late 18th century argued, suicide seemed to come from a variety of different situations and scenarios. For many, the rise of suicide rates in Europe were intrinsically connected to urbanity and living in the towns. For critics of increasing secularization, suicide was often seen as a fault of irreligion or dangerous philosophies. As the causes of suicide were increasingly debated in the 18th century, the environment that the suicide occurred in began to play an increasing role in analysis and explanation as well. Britain, for example, had long gained a reputation across Europe for being a nation of suicidal people who all suffered from what was seen as the English malady. Many Europeans, without any real data, erroneously believed that this was caused by the poor climate and a society that seemed to overly wallow in developing notions of sensibility and emotion. This continental belief was believed by many Britons too, who wrote extensively on epidemics of self-murder across the century from the point of view of this critique. Beyond Europe, tropical climates had long been seen as particularly dangerous cause of insanity and therefore suicide. Many eyewitnesses to the two deaths placed this factor as the cause. These thoughts on the dangers of the tropics dovetailed neatly with older ideas such as nostalgia and melancholy. Nostalgia was a poorly defined explanation for insanity that revolved around being overwhelmed by a longing for home or a return to the familiar that generally afflicted sailors in particular. It was seen to be a particular maritime malady. Melancholy was a similarly vague term that emerged at the end of the 17th century that was more general. It ranged from someone who may have suffered from what might be termed today as a genuine mental health issue, etc., to an individual that to critical European eyes was just being fashionably emotional and therefore part of the problem that they observed with the English in particular. Not so much the Scottish though, even though their weather is worse, which is interesting. To our understanding today, both ideas would involve an array of mental health conditions that are now clinically explained with modern science. But both ideas formed part of the 18th century mental health landscape and understanding that these men experienced. Now, I might point out that some pictures here, this is the kind of ship, this is the Alarm, this is a frigate in the top left-hand corner. This is actually a picture of young Lieutenant Horatio Nelson, but not too dissimilar from young Captain Vaughan, who was in his early 30s, as I'll explain. A general in the British Army, this is a brigadier general, that would be wearing and looking pretty similar to Colin Lindsay as he would have looked in the 1795. Colin Lindsay's older brother was the 6th Earl of Balcarres. So we don't have a picture of Colin Lindsay, but we do have a picture of his older brother, because he became the governor of Jamaica at the time that his younger brother was made a brigadier general. And there's another brother who's the Attorney General of occupied Tobago. So it's a family business. The Scots are right into this. They're all over Grenada. Indeed, the governor, Ninian Hume, was a Scotsman as well. Indeed, half the council were. So the Scots were big in the Southern Caribbean as a place of opportunity in the late 18th century. And this family is particularly involved. On the right, you see images of the West Indian regiments. These were formed directly because of the Grenada conflict. They had to arm Africans to help defend the empire. And by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there would be 10 regiments of black troops defending slave colonies in the Caribbean for the British. And so these are very much images of the 1790s in the Caribbean. Okay, so popular culture in the later 18th century increasingly addressed the subject as well of suicide, not just in the published philosophical debates between, say, Hume, Smith, Voltaire, or Rousseau, or the theorizing of eminent medical men, but increasingly plays, books, pamphlets, popular songs, and jokes all made repeated reference to suicide, its results or its effects. This popular engagement with the subject had been a feature of British literary and social life since the late 17th century, but it grew more open and direct and far more prevalent from the 1770s onwards, the years in which Lindsay and Vaughan were both growing up. Lindsay was about 33, Lindsay was about 43, Vaughan was about 33. So they're approaching maturity, I suppose, middle age. Studies have shown that wealth, class, social position, and service all play an influential role in a victim's outlook and the circumstances that might inform a death. Both Vaughan and Lindsay came from different backgrounds and different worlds, but their biographies can tell us much in this regard. George Vaughan was the younger son of minor gentry family from the outskirts of Bath. As his older brother inherited the estate, in 1788, Vaughan took advantage of the fact that his uncle was a naval man who worked directly for Admiral Sir John Jervis, not too dissimilar to young Horatio Nelson, who also got his start in the Royal Navy because of a well-placed uncle. To gain a place on a ship as a midshipman, and from there, his brief but promising naval career took off. He was noted for his skill and ability. He was one of the best, as it turns out. By contrast, Colin Lindsay was very different in background, circumstances, and profession. Colin Lindsay was slightly older than Vaughan, in his mid-40s, the younger brother of the wealthy Earl of Balcarres, a senior Scottish nobleman and a military man like his younger brother. Joining the army just before the American War of Independence, Lord Lindsay quickly rose through the ranks both by purchase and by performance. Lindsay was also a liberal, educated man. In fact, just 2 years before his final posting, he had written a book which highlighted military innovations over the course of the 18th century. As such, Lindsay was clearly a man who took the business of soldiering very seriously and was quite the expert. This is obvious in the way that he excoriated his gross blunders, as he put it, and the fact that he made far too many mistakes, stressed the word far. What should have been a quick, relatively easy operation had been turned through his incompetence and negligence, as he described himself, into a disaster. This was, in fact, not the case. His mistakes were on the whole very minor ones, which, given the situation, were completely understandable. This only makes his bitter self-rebuke, not to mention state of mind, only more poignant and wretched. When Edward Joseph wrote his History of Trinidad in 1830, which talked of the incident with Captain Vaughan from the recollections of people who actually were still alive to remember it, he argued that Captain Vaughan's death was due to his sense of shame. Joseph played up Vaughan's sense of honour and his desire to revenge the insult offered. According to Joseph, Vaughan ended his life to atone for what, on calm reflection, said the author, the poor captain believed were the consequences of profound errors of judgment and his loss of honour. This is borne out similarly in Lindsay's last dispatch as well, who likewise spoke in terms of honour. Notions of honour were therefore a particular feature of both suicides, but in different ways. The 18th century represented a shift in concepts of honour, commensurate with the changing dynamics of society that were played out to most effect in the military and on the battlefield. Whereas in the late 17th century, a man's honour was tied to concepts of personal honour and family honour, The professionalization of such a vital part of the nation, such as the Navy or the Army, drove notions of honor to move away from the idea of the personal affront, which might induce a duel, for example, to one where honor became more attached to work performance, group performance, and evolving understandings of service and duty. As officers in command, both Vaughan and Lindsay understood honor as intrinsically tied to their leadership and whether or not it was seen as successful and effective. For Vaughan, however, his sense of honor was still expressed as one might have engaged in a duel. It was about addressing an affront or a wrong. Perhaps Vaughan's actions therefore represent a sense of honor in transition, whereas Lindsay represents honor that had moved beyond the affront to be avenged and was instead tied directly and wholly to his professional work performance. So we see that in transition with these two suicides. Both men demonstrated clearly that the honor of their reputations were at stake. Their position was performative also, however, with the code of honor requiring them to lead bravely from the front into unfamiliar and insecure danger. This code of honor helped officers make sense of their surroundings by providing them with a personal and social structure they could rely on. But it underscored the fragility of their sense of honor and reputation, which could easily be impinged upon or damaged. As research using anecdotal evidence and memoirs from the 1790s through to the 1850s has shown, very often military suicides in this period were often induced by a perception of personal failure or mistake from otherwise excellent soldiers over what was often a trivial event. A key dynamic of this overwhelming sense of failure, therefore, was a lack of proportion and situational awareness when coming to terms with a given situation or position. Both Lindsay and Vaughan saw their failures in stark, unrealistic terms, which completely exaggerated in their own minds their own errors, seeing them far more consequential than they really were. For his part, Vaughan was also a serious professional. Like Nelson and so many others of this generation, he was a typical officer of the Navy, which since the early 18th century and through necessity had been open to talent and merit. Even so, he was still a product of an age of patronage who relied on a leg up in the first place and ongoing favor. In a time of war, this favor from well-placed relations and contacts could only come if he delivered, which he clearly believed he had not. Unfamiliarity and quite possibly isolated loneliness was a factor for both men, nor was religion a comfort for either of them. They were not religious. The isolation of these two officers, distant from home and their men, including their officers, was compounded by other associated factors. As both men discovered, this was not a European war against a wholly European foe, fighting in a European way or even North American way, with which Lindsay experienced at length. The language was unfamiliar and strange. The divisions, both political and social, were complex. Moreover, the racial dynamic to this war, which was all-pervasive, coupled with the labor regime and its unfamiliar codes, this was a new world for both men. This partly explains why Lindsay made the mistakes he did in his estimation of the enemy, which he thought was quite good, and why Vaughan overreached himself. The French Revolution brought fundamental changes and a complete reordering of societies that was still new and evolving when the two officers joined the fight. To British military commanders, it was very threatening, with ready and receptive ears found across the world, including, as Vaughan discovered, even among their own troops, some of whom deserted as they came within range of Trinidad. Others were caught and flogged for trying to do so. This was especially so in the complex volatility of the Caribbean. Finally, we know suicides influence many people who were around the victim. This proximity can and does often lead to further copycat or imitative suicides. Often these associated deaths use the same method or circumstance. Sometimes, however, a death might lead to a further phenomenon, that of the suicide cluster. Sociologist David Phillips has coined the term the Werther effect, or from the book Goethe's Tales of Young Werther, which kicked off a wave of suicides in the 1770s in Europe, to describe the dark attraction and pull of a suicide on others in a group. Indeed, the broadcasting and publicizing of suicides is now tightly controlled, with film, television, and the media in many countries all adhering to a strict code of conduct when writing or broadcasting about suicide, for the very reason that details such as the method used or the direct circumstances of death can have a devastating impact on suicide rates and the way they are carried out. Suicide contagion is very real and accepted concept, which is now well recorded and, at least to a degree, a well understood phenomenon. To conclude, though, The details of these two deaths are important as they allow us to explore the concept of military suicide in a period and a place in which we have little information. The fact that there was so much commonality between the two men and that each death seemed to come from a variety of factors adds further value to these records. Crucially, because these men were connected to each other in multiple ways, this article has been able to, or this paper has been able to use new science to compare the two deaths against each other. And in so doing, this article has been able to ask more of this history than would be the case with just one death. And while we can never know how widespread suicide was among soldiers serving in this war, these two examples of it help us to understand how they may have occurred in the context of this time and place. The lack of realistic appraisal from both men and the unbalanced critique they gave to their own actions underscores their isolation in an unfamiliar environment, fighting unfamiliar foes who held what for them were disturbing views and beliefs. At the same time, both men were surrounded by death and disease on a scale neither man, nor anyone else for that matter, had ever seen before. There was a major yellow fever outbreak that killed hundreds of thousands of people in the space of 4 years. For Lindsay, he was working with soldiers who were not only cobbled together at the last minute, but were ill-disciplined, poorly trained and uncontrollable when it came to drink and looting in particular. He also had to deal with a cowardly and disobedient militia who were completely unreliable and take command of enslaved Africans of whom he was unfamiliar and whose performance was likewise variable. Vaughan similarly suffered from isolation in unfamiliar waters. He was dealing with a rebellious and even revolutionary crew and supported by an officer corps who he didn't know and who he did not fraternize with. He was clearly making decisions based on his limited experience rather than the reality. The pressures on both men were high, but so was their sense of honor and duty and their sense of professionalism, which may have served to undermine their mental health further. Finally, while the two men were in different services and from different backgrounds, both of them were the products of a fluid age, especially with regard to changing mores of science over religion and an ever-evolving cultural landscape, which not only made suicide more acceptable, but also grounded it not in sin and condemnation, but in passion, reason, and explanation. The deaths of Lindsay and Vaughan act, therefore, as an important window for observing attitudinal changes towards suicide at the end of the 18th century and for exploring the difficulties that these men faced and the nuances of their positions that may have influenced their decisions. Thank you, everybody. Sorry I went over a little bit.
Thank you, Kit.
Picture up. Right.
All right, well, we do have some time for questions. Session.
That was really interesting. Can you say a bit more, particularly in the case of Lindsay, about the role of race? Because, I mean, he's clearly, some of his criticisms of his own troops are racially sort of determined. My understanding he's going, did I understand correctly that Fédon is of mixed?
He's mixed race, yes.
So is part of the reason this defeat is stinging because he's made assumptions about his opponents on the basis of race, and then he's judging his own defeat in part, defeated not just but defeated by these people who are not white. What's going on?
Okay, it's really interesting. Okay, so in brief, both Vaughan, the commander-in-chief, he's the new commander-in-chief, and Lindsay are Loctite. Their careers have been together. They looked after each other through the American War of Independence. They don't want to be in the Caribbean. Most of the regular army don't like the Caribbean. They don't like slavery, and they don't like the planters. They don't like the way the place is run. And they really hate this situation. They don't want to be there. They feel that they're defending a regime they don't like. It's not the regime that they're used to in Britain. They feel that they're working for the planters and not the empire, and they're being told what to do by local leaders who are all themselves slave owners. Actually, Vaughan's appreciation of the armed troops that are mixed race and black is actually quite good. He actually thinks they're quite good. The problem is the white troops. Right. They're all over the place. So he's got a real problem there. But also you're dealing with other people that he's having to work with who are very racially focused. So, for example, the militia, who form a major part of his force, are all very racist, and they're all very much into owning enslaved people, because these are all the younger sons of planters or planters themselves. So he's sort of pushed in that he doesn't have the full command that he wants to. They have to do what he says, but he's aware of this racial element. He's not keen on it at all. He doesn't like that. So that's a good question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kit. And I think you nailed it in terms of providing us with stories in context and thinking about how you might position those in literature in a wider sort of frame. I had a sort of similar kind of observation question, and I've got another question if that's all right. Building on the back of that one around white masculinity. And so the idea of this revolutionary moment, and even though they may have been sympathetic in terms of the politics of this moment, when you talk about their reputation and their dwelling on that reputation, I think that's quite critical to this,
Absolutely.
And so the idea of there's a bit of literature around, as I'm sure you've read, around the mental breakdown of white men in empire, around empire, and critical moments of imperialism and its decline. I think that could be really useful, but you could add to the literature because it would be from a different angle in a sense,
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really, this war in the 1790s in the Caribbean is fundamental in breaking down Anglo slavery, because they're so desperate that Lindsay's standing, it begins with Lindsay, he's standing in the town square at St. George and he goes, I need armed blacks, we need slaves, we need everyone we can. They worked out they're really good soldiers and their survival rate is much higher because they have more resistance to yellow fever. So as I said, by the end of the war, there are 10 regiments, there are 12,000 ex-enslaved, now in British uniforms, defending slavery. This breaks down the racial barrier from the high point of Atlantic racism, which is sort of 1780s, 1790s. The reality means that by the 1830s, slavery is banned in the British Empire and they get rid of it. It's a major crack appears in the 1790s because of this need and the evident reality that black soldiers are actually better than white soldiers. They survive longer, but they fight harder. They have a real stake because this is their land. They're not from Africa. Africa was their grandparents or their parents. These are people born in, this is their country they're fighting for, whereas these troops are coming from Britain. They don't want to be there. They're lackluster and they're dying in droves.
So it's a really kind of interesting moment. It could go either way if you're a white male in that environment. And the other question I have, I don't think you mentioned this, were there any military coronial inquests for these guys? So do we know?
No, because they want to bury it.
Yeah.
And they were really obvious. So Vaughan literally goes into his cabin on a packed ship. There's 300 sailors on that thing. And suddenly he disappears. An hour later, where's the captain gone? And so people saw this happen on the ship. He threw himself overboard and then they found the body. Lindsay, it's 5:30 in the morning. The guard, the picket, everyone is around. People are waking up and he just shoots himself in front of everybody. He can't hide it. So they don't want an inquest into this because it's suicide and that looks bad. So they're trying to bury it. And that's what, and also, of course, this begins a whole series of conflicts. They don't have time for this. They're trying to save the empire. And this is the most valuable part of the empire in the 1790s. 25% of Britain's foreign trade was with 4 islands in the Caribbean at the end of the 18th century. It was worth more than the whole of North America. Jamaica, Barbados, Grenada, and Antigua. That's where it is. That's where the money is. That's why they give up on the 13 colonies, because they want to save the money in Jamaica. So they give up and they send the fleet to the Caribbean to protect it from the French. That is still ongoing. That emphasis doesn't go because the American War ends in 83. And then in 89, the French Revolution breaks out. And so Britain's focus becomes the Caribbean again. So all those people from the American War, like Lindsay and Vaughan, his boss, they're all still in situ and then they end up in the Caribbean. So it's a key moment. And the Grenada War, it's a small little thing in a world of conflict, but that's the moment that they start arming Africans en masse to defend the empire. And that changes racism, changes slavery. It's a key moment like that. In fact, there are all these books about, the foundation of the West Indian regiments as a thing. And I've written a couple of articles about this moment, right, as part of that process. And I have to review for the American Historical Review the latest book about of the West Indian regiments as being this kind of moment.
Yeah.
And it's a very important thing. So yeah, it's a really happening part of historiography. Yeah, it's cool.
Well, that brings us to time. Thanks, everybody. Nancy does have a question we can take offline perhaps, and maybe you can address that in an email. I just wanted to thank everybody. We do have a 2-week break, so one more, there's no seminars next week, and then we have our first mid-semester break. And then we resume with 3 talks in 1 week in week 6, all on ancient history. So we have our visiting professor from the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens giving 2 talks, and then we have an Egyptologist from Macquarie, Julia Hamilton, coming to give a talk on that Friday. So lots coming up in 2 weeks, but we have 2 weeks to rest up and build the energy for that. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in 3 weeks.
Thank you, everyone.